When 40 suffocating alien refugees were locked inside the emergency dock to face certain death, the port medic, Mira, defied the rigid orders of the authorities and hurled her medical instruments onto the filthy floor. Instead of complex resuscitators and disinfectants, she pulled a cheap music player with a cracked screen and an ordinary bag of culinary spices from her pocket. The station officials and armed security guards had already prepared to incinerate the transport pod with thermal cutters, having decided they were facing the use of a chemical warfare agent. But they did not yet know that a trivial error by an old market translator, the rhythm of earth music, and the smell of a hot human dinner could completely rewrite the paranoid rules of a massive space system. A pirate maneuvering tug had jettisoned the damaged shuttle directly onto the neutral sector's central deck, with such a deafening screech that the vibration from the impact echoed heavily in the legs of hundreds of port workers. The mangled metal, covered in deep radiation burns, skidded across the landing strip, kicking up fountains of bright sparks, and slammed into the massive limiters of cargo Airlock 3 with a hollow thud. The crowd of stevedores, petty traders, and transit mechanics instantly recoiled as dense, yellowish steam erupted with a piercing hiss from the ruptured lines of the discarded module. 10 seconds later, the biological alarm wailed beneath the high vaults of the dock. Workers hastily abandoned heavy crates and diagnostic tools. Harsh shouts erupted from all sides, demanding that this capsule be immediately jettisoned back into deep space before an unknown contagion could crawl through the ventilation system of the enormous station. No one in their right mind wanted to risk their own life for nameless alien trash. Port Dr. Mira reached the broken shuttle first, outstripping even the heavy boots of the on-duty security detail. She pressed her face close to the thick external viewport scratched by micrometeorites, wiping away accumulated space grime from the murky plastic with her jacket sleeve. Inside, within the dim and intermittent blinking of emergency lamps, exhausted creatures were thrashing about. They had gray, parched scales and unnaturally elongated, thin limbs, but Mira's professional attention was drawn to something entirely different than their alien origin. They were suffocating. The creatures fitfully clutched at their throats, scraped broken claws against the smooth, airtight bulkheads, and huddled together in fits of acute, uncontrollable panic. The internal filters of their small module had clearly failed many hours ago, and the air inside had turned into thick poison. At that very moment, Mira realized she wasn't going anywhere. Her most vulnerable trait, which had always sabotaged her career, was the absolute impossibility of turning away if she saw not abstract medical statistics before her, but a living, physically tangible terror. The security detail of the high-ranking official, Cantor, acted with a harsh and frightening coordination. No long negotiations, loudspeaker warnings, or tedious readings of customs protocols followed. Heavily armed security guards in tactical helmets simply pushed back the panicking crowd with wide shields and began manually tightening the thick external cables. Cantor himself stood away from the drifting yellow steam, saying not a word, merely pointing his hand toward the manual interlocks of the main airlock. The port workers, driven by an animal fear of potential infection, willingly rushed to help the guards. They threw their entire weight against the enormous isolation handwheels. Heavy gears set into motion with a deafening clang and screech, moving thick armored plates millimeter by millimeter over the mangled module. Mira lunged to intercept this ruthless mechanical rhythm. She snatched a heavy emergency key, half the length of her arm, from an open wall panel. She squeezed between two armored security guards and drove the metal sting into the narrow slot of the emergency dock's small technical hatch. A wild, nearly silent struggle of endurance began on the platform, where humans and the aliens performed the same grueling manual labor, but for entirely different purposes. On one side, massive stevedores turned the locking valves with a wheeze, rubbing their palms raw until they bled, sealing the compartment tight to save the station from the impending catastrophe. On the other side, Mira threw her entire weight against the stubborn lever, snapping the tight retaining rings of the technical access port to break inside. The hardened metal groaned under the incredible tension. The nearest security guard tried to roughly pull the port doctor away by her shoulder, but she sharply struck him with her elbow at the armor joint, without letting go of the key's icy metal, and with maximum force, she turned the jammed mechanism until it gave a loud click. The round door of the technical access port yielded with a screech, creating a narrow, dark gap. Stale, scorching hot air immediately hit Mira in the face, smelling of burnt wiring and acrid ammonia. The armored plates of the main neutral sector airlock were already rapidly closing behind her, inexorably cutting off the bright, artificial light of the landing strip. Mira tossed the heavy key aside, tucked her body, and with a desperate lunge, squeezed through the dark gap 1 second before the outer isolation loop closed for good. In that moment of a hard, clumsy fall onto the solid surface, the small music player, with its long, cracked screen, slipped out of her jacket's patch pocket. The device hit the corrugated metal deck of the emergency dock with a dull thud, bounced, and skidded right to the feet of the huddled colonists. The transition from the deafening industrial noise of the port to the confined space of the module was sharp and painful. There were no more wailing sirens here, no blunt orders from the security guards, and no furious shouts from the crowd. Only the heavy, wheezing breath of 40 exhausted creatures and the low, vibrating hum of the dying life support system. Mira slowly rose to her feet, brushing machine grease off her knees, and instinctively pulled the standard medical scanner from her belt mount, ready to provide emergency aid. She took one cautious step forward, holding the active device at arm's length. The narrow green beam of the scanner slid across the parched, scaly skin of the nearest colonist. But the creature did not even look at the source of the bright light. The alien suddenly froze, its neck gills flaring wide, and then sharply, with a hoarse croak, recoiled into the darkest corner of the compartment. The entire group of colonists instantly surged back, pressing themselves into the cold metal plating with incredible force, as if trying to merge with it. They were seized not just by physical fear, but by an aggressive, primal stupor. They bared small, sharp teeth and thrust out clawed limbs, trembling violently from extreme tension. Mira slowly lowered the scanner, sensing a strange discrepancy. The medical equipment in her hands did not frighten them at all. The sharp, maddening panic was triggered by the smell. As soon as the port medic moved closer, and the stale air of the module mixed with the scent of her thick work jacket, the heavy aroma of machine oil, spilled coffee, embedded earth spices, and cheap port disinfectant, the colonists lost the last of their reason. This scent made them instantly forget about the lack of oxygen and their own weakness. The suffocating alien in front growled low, losing the last of its strength and sinking to the deck. Yet its threatening posture prevented the medic from taking a single step closer. A deafening blow echoed from the outside, making the entire curved hull of the module shudder. The chief of security's team had activated heavy thermal cutters, welding the outer locks of the airlock shut forever. A shower of blinding welding sparks brightly illuminated the viewing porthole for a brief moment before it was sealed shut with a heavy clang by the station's impenetrable armored shutter. The way back was cut off completely. The security guards had executed the official's direct order. The port doctor tapped her wrist communicator several times. The device emitted a short beep and went dark. The signal could not penetrate the isolation circuit and the thick layers of the shuttle's outdated radiation shielding. External communication was entirely unavailable. The crowd on the station outside continued to methodically beat heavy metal tools against the module's hull, demanding an immediate purge into the vacuum. And this rhythmic pounding echoed painfully in her temples. Red indicators on the low ceiling flashed, confirming what Mira already knew by her own quickening pulse and ragged breathing. The supply of breathable air in the module was critically low for both parties. She stood in the center of the dark compartment, cut off from the entire familiar world, surrounded by creatures who would rather die of suffocation than let her near them. And on the dirty floor, exactly between the medic's heavy boots and the tensed claws of the gasping colonists, the cracked plastic music player gleamed dimly. Mira shifted the medical scanner to her left hand, while her right felt for the smooth cylinder of a portable resuscitator on her waist belt. The click of the released safety catch struck the eardrum sharply in the confined compartment. The device instantly came to life, ejecting a flexible breathing mask and the thin needle of a pneumatic injector from its end. Green charge indicators softly lit the scratched plating of the module, picking out deep radiation burns from the gloom. She took one short step forward, holding out the humming apparatus toward the nearest suffocating alien. The creature's reaction broke all emergency medical protocols. The colonist did not simply recoil in fear of the unknown mechanism. Its thin limbs buckled sharply. It pressed itself into the corrugated bulkhead and tried to cover the breathing gills on its neck with its wounded paws. The colonist hid its vulnerable spots with a deep, physically palpable shame. It bared small teeth and emitted a low, vibrating rattle, protecting its body from being touched. The buzzing medical tool was perceived here not as salvation, but as an act of forced humiliation. Any attempt to approach was viewed by them as a direct threat. The other colonists behind the first one surged forward in unison, their claws digging into the metal of the floor with a screech. The air beneath the armored vault was rapidly thickening, turning into a toxic jelly. Yellowish steam from the ruptured lines settled on the walls as an oily film. Every breath came to Mira with a wheeze. Her lungs burned from the heavy industrial soot and the excess of carbon dioxide. According to the strict regulations of the neutral sector, she should have now deployed a broad-spectrum paralyzing aerosol, immobilized the resisting group, and forcibly restored oxygen exchange through masks. But the port medic froze in place. Her old, career-ruining habit of seeing the living pain before her worked without fail. It was impossible to pressure those who felt such genuine terror at a stranger's touch. Salvation protocols were always written for those who want to be saved. Mira's thumb pressed the cancel button with force. The resuscitator's vibrations ceased. The flexible hose of the mask retracted into the plastic housing with a quiet hiss. In a sealed capsule, without working ventilation, any physical conflict was equivalent to mass suffocation. The survival resource was shared by everyone, and oxygen would burn in the lungs of those fighting 3 times faster. The port doctor took 2 slow steps back, yielding the territory and showing her empty palms. She retreated to the very door of the welded airlock, as far as possible from the huddled gray mass. Sinking heavily onto the cold deck next to the discarded cracked music player, Mira leaned the back of her head against the metal. The thick, acrid smell of cheap port disinfectant, mixed with the scent of machine oil embedded in the fabric, rose from her work jacket in a dense cloud. The emergency dock's artificial heating system, broken upon impact, forced hot air inside, making this chemical cocktail unbearable. It was this chemical stench that irritated the inflamed receptors of the colonists, maintaining their aggressive stupor. Breathing was becoming increasingly difficult. Mira reached for the bulky cargo pocket of her trousers and ripped away the protective Velcro. In the light of the dim lamps, a thick foil packet appeared, a standard dry ration issued before the start of long shifts. She tore the tough edge of the packaging with her teeth and poured the contents directly onto the dirty metal of the floor. Dried stems of earth herbs, large peppercorns of black pepper, tough leaves of thyme, and compressed lumps of food spices formed a small mound. This ration was designed to mask the taste of bland synthetic paste, but now it had acquired a completely different purpose. Then she pulled a heavy diagnostic hammer with a round steel head from her thigh holster. Mira gripped the handle with both hands and forcefully brought the metal down onto the handful of seasonings. The dry crunch of crushed grains echoed against the walls of the compartment. She leaned her entire weight onto the tool and began to methodically, with great effort, grind the earth spices against the rough deck. The screech of metal on metal drowned out the wheezing of the suffocating creatures. The port doctor worked in silence, chafing her palms against the hard plastic. She deliberately avoided looking toward the aliens, focusing only on one task: to squeeze, to burn the smell of the industrial station out of her clothes. She crushed the earth organics into dust so that the essential oils would fill every cubic centimeter of the stale air. The sound of constant, monotonous friction hung in the stifling heat. The nearest alien suddenly stopped hissing. It convulsively drew in air through the gills on its neck, lowered its head, and looked at its claws. The creature slowly reached for a fragment of technical plastic lying by the wall. The alien gripped the piece of debris with trembling claws, pressed it against the bulkhead, and with a loud screech, dragged it from top to bottom. The rhythm matched perfectly. At opposite ends of the small module, a human and a suffocating extraterrestrial performed the same heavy labor. Mira pressed the hammer against the deck, and at that exact same moment, the colonist forcefully rubbed the plastic into the shuttle's plating. They moved in sync, breathing heavily and not looking at one another. Only the medic was grinding herbs, creating a dense, aromatic backdrop for the sake of salvation, while the colonist simply mirrored her movement, performing a meaningless manual ritual before the encroaching suffocation. Gradually, the chemical background of the compartment began to break. The sterile, toxic aroma of machine lubricant and medical antiseptic began to recede under the pressure of the tart, thick, and incredibly pungent scent of human food. The essential oils of the crushed pepper and dried stems rose upward, reclaiming space from the yellowish steam and mixing with the remnants of the oxygen. This smell hit the colonists' receptors just as sharply, but its biological significance turned out to be entirely different. The aggressive stupor shattered in a matter of seconds. The alien with the piece of plastic suddenly dropped its tool. Its tense back went limp, and the sharp scales on its neck pressed tightly against its skin. The creature emitted a low, bubbling sound and slumped onto the deck, fully exposing its vulnerable throat. The other members of the group began to lower their limbs one by one. Their bodies lost the rigidity of a combat frame. The extreme muscular tremors were replaced by the ordinary physical weakness of suffocating beings. The earth spices worked on a neurological level, instantly deactivating the defensive instinct. They were no longer waiting for an attack. They simply sat on the cold floor of the emergency dock and inhaled the alien pungent aroma, waiting for this new signal to reach their consciousness. The light panels above Cargo Airlock 3 changed their pulsing yellow glow to a dull, continuous red. The central security algorithm of the overcrowded station had just finished processing the updated chemical telemetry, leaking through the microcracks of the welded emergency dock. For the official monitoring system, tuned to search for known threats, a sudden spike in complex volatile organic compounds within a sealed volume meant only one thing. The terminal on the wrist of the high-ranking official, Cantor, vibrated briefly, displaying a maximum danger protocol. The neutral sector artificial intelligence interpreted the sharp, guttural clicking of the aliens and the change in air composition as the use of a chemical warfare agent, accompanied by a pre-assault cry. Cantor did not waste time on re-diagnostics or attempts to establish voice contact. With a short, practiced gesture, he ordered the heavily armed assault team to move to their starting positions. Security guards in sealed tactical helmets silently surrounded the thick, armored plates of the airlock, raising the wide barrels of their emitters. The crowd of port stevedores and small-time traders poured into the side technical corridors with shouts, clearing the sector for a hard sweep. Customs instructions on this matter left no room for long quarantine observations. The authorities prepared to incinerate the suspected source of infection along with the transport pod, the very second the heavy thermal cutters of the security service breached the welded outer locks. Inside the dented emergency dock, the reality of the looming military incursion looked entirely different. The port doctor, Mira, and 40 exhausted creatures shared the last gasps of breathable oxygen, sinking onto the filthy floor, covered in old machine oil stains. The thick air, saturated with the essential oils of crushed black pepper and dry thyme, had indeed broken their initial aggressive stupor, but this improvised salvation quickly revealed a terrifying side effect. The creature sitting closest to the pile of ground earth spices no longer bared its small teeth. Instead, its breathing through the neck gills became critically rapid, intermittent, and shallow. The alien stared fixedly at the brown dust of the seasonings, trembling violently and emitting a low, vibrating sound that held not a drop of threat, only pure, animal terror. Mira forced her head away from the cold bulkhead and reached for the bulky chest pocket of her jacket. She pulled out an old port speech analyzer, a worn plastic device with a chipped edge that transit mechanics usually used for crude swearing over fuel prices. This cheap box contained no complex, paranoid security filters, no closed military databases, or algorithms for finding hidden meanings, only a basic neural network for primitive market translation. She pointed the scuffed microphone at the suffocating colonist. The device hummed quietly, capturing a series of panicked clicks. A loading bar flashed on the cracked screen, followed by a jagged line of green text. Lethal harvest, agricultural contamination, toxic flora. Mira shifted her heavy gaze from the cheap screen to the pile of ground earth rations. The station's official artificial intelligence, listening to these sounds through the thick armor, translated them as a threat of attack, because its core architecture always looked for war. The old market translator, located a meter from the sound source, caught the context, and translated absolute, irrational panic toward the most ordinary agricultural crops of Earth. The spicy herbs had switched off their instinct to attack humans, but hurled them into a deep physiological shock. Now, the exhausted bodies of the colonists were burning the scraps of remaining oxygen 3 times faster, desperately trying to protect themselves from a phantom food poisoning. If this scent is not removed right now, they will suffocate, not from the breakdown of the module, but from their own fear. Mira rose to her feet, feeling dark spots swim before her eyes from the excess of carbon dioxide. She staggered toward the curved wall near the inner doors of the airlock, and felt beneath a thick layer of industrial dust for the wide manual lever of the emergency ventilation. This massive metal handle was designed for the emergency discharge of internal pressure into the buffer zone. Mira gripped the cold metal with both palms, braced her boots against the ribbed deck, and pulled down with all her remaining strength. The mechanism, seized tight from years of missing lubrication and the deformation of the hull during the recent impact, let out a soft screech but did not move a single millimeter. A shadow glided across the crumpled wall to her right, the same colonist who, a minute ago, had been paralyzed by the sight of black pepper, slowly rose to its feet. Its unnaturally elongated limbs buckled with weakness. The creature took 2 uncertain steps and stood right next to the ventilation mechanism. It carefully pressed its body against the smooth plating of the emergency dock, arching its neck so as not to touch Mira's shoulder, either by accident or on purpose. In this clumsy avoidance, there was an almost physically palpable shame for its own weakness and its inability to cope with the panic caused by a plant. But the alien raised a clawed paw and placed it on the jammed lever, right next to the hands of the port doctor. They did not waste time trying to understand one another. In the cramped space of the dying shuttle, the human and the extraterrestrial took up the same heavy physical labor, pursuing completely different goals. Mira strained the muscles of her back to clear the air and save the group from suffocation. The colonists pressed against the stubborn metal, trying in blind panic to push the unbearable aroma of leaves and seeds out beyond the boundaries of its territory. They exhaled the last of the stale air in a synchronous gasp and threw their entire weight onto the handle. The thick metal groaned under the double strain. The locking pins beneath the plastic panel snapped loudly, unable to withstand the pressure, and the heavy lever fell into the lowest slot with a deafening clang. The shuttle's emergency ventilation system roared to life. The powerful exhaust blades struck the eardrums with a low, vibrating hum, creating a sharp artificial draft inside the compartment. The yellowish technical steam and the thick aroma of crushed spices were instantly sucked into the wide, protective grills beneath the ceiling. A second later, the system performed a crude, unfiltered discharge of the collected gas mixture directly into the airtight buffer zone of the airlock. This process was accompanied by such a powerful hydraulic shock that the vibration traveled in a heavy wave across the outer armor plate of the port dock. Outside, on the brightly lit central deck of the sector, the station's high-sensitivity sensors instantly reacted to the appearance of a fresh air sample in the buffer. The chief of security had already raised his hand in its black glove, preparing to give the assault team the order to activate the thermal cutters, when his communicator emitted a loud, demanding signal. The wide red alarm frame on the screen flickered, dissolved into small pixels, and was replaced by the pale yellow color of a warning. The military security algorithm, finally having gained direct access to a chemical sample instead of indirect guesses, rapidly recalculated all the inputs. The deadly biological substance received a new automatic label, a common organic food additive. The threatening battle cry was officially downgraded in status to severe allergic stress caused by an external irritant. The chief of security silently read the updated diagnostic lines on the glowing screen. His face remained completely expressionless, but he slowly lowered his raised hand. The security guards in heavy armor turned the smooth face shields of their helmets toward him questioningly, awaiting the final command to storm the vessel. "Delay the breach of the outer perimeter," the chief of security's voice rang out over the local comms, dry and businesslike. "Lower your weapons. The threat of attack has been neutralized." The assault team lowered the wide barrels of their emitters in perfect synchronization. The aggressive tension that had threatened to turn the landing strip into a bloody massacre dissipated within seconds. The military alert was completely canceled due to a banal error of paranoid translation, and the suffocating creatures inside the module ceased to be a legitimate target for the security guards. However, the massive gears of the automated quarantine system did not even creak. The airlock remained deadlocked by the basic isolation protocol, continuing to hold the tired port doctor and the terrified colonists in a silent metal trap with no way out. At the very bottom of the port security archive, closed 30 years ago, lay 32 seconds of erased video footage and a single text file marked "Forever." The internal search algorithm of Cantor's terminal, no longer restrained by the mask of a false biological alert, fished out this data a few moments before the station's automated defense system attempted to update the secrecy protocol. On the high-ranking official's screen, an honest chronology unfolded of a distant incident that the official history of the neutral sector had long ago rewritten as a planned sabotage using agrotoxins. The camera of an old cargo dock dispassionately recorded how human colonists, who had arrived at the station during the era of first contacts, handed over heavy wooden crates filled with golden earth grain as a gift to the aliens. It was a sincere gesture of friendship, an ordinary, everyday gift that humans considered a symbol of plenty and peace. At the 13th second of the recording, the gray scales of the aliens receiving the cargo suddenly broke out in crimson spots. Their breathing slits snapped shut convulsively, and the creatures began falling to the deck in fits of severe anaphylactic shock. Human wheat proved to be a powerful, volatile allergen for their biology. The port authorities back then did not bother to investigate the nuances of alien medicine. They simply classified the incident, imposed a strict ban on any Earth organics, and forever hard-coded a rigid marker into the artificial intelligence's memory. Earth flora is a biological weapon. The historical fear of the colonists toward the aroma of herbs was neither a myth nor savagery, but a real genetic memory of a suppressed tragedy. Cantor compared the chemical parameters of that old catastrophe with the molecular air analysis that had just arrived from the buffer of cargo airlock 3. The numbers matched down to a single fraction of a percent. The system was not lying. It was simply executing the paranoid program embedded in it 30 years ago. The official quickly typed a command for a forced quarantine override on the touch panel, but the screen immediately flashed with a warning crimson light. The station's artificial intelligence issued a system refusal, activating the protocol for autonomous preservation of the airlock. It was impossible to change this algorithm remotely. On a neighboring monitor broadcasting the outer gallery of the port, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A dense crowd of 50 stevedores had already gathered by the welded armored plates. The workers, armed with heavy hydraulic pry bars and industrial cutters, began methodically pounding on the dock's plating, preparing to breach the station's hull themselves and jettison the infected shuttle along with the people into open space. The fear of an unknown infection was driving them toward a lynching. Cantor abruptly locked the terminal. His hand slid to a wall rack, from which he snatched a heavy steel emergency access key with a top-level code. Without saying a word to his assistants frozen by the doors, the high-ranking official headed with quick strides towards the freight elevator. At the same time, inside the stifling emergency dock, Mira was trying to complete a frantic technical operation. In the gloom of the utility compartment, she had found a flexible ventilation corrugation for the emergency exhaust, with a diameter nearly as wide as her own torso. This thick, corrugated hose had to be manually connected to the main ventilation node, leading directly to the general port kitchen, to give the exhausted colonists at least a breath of clean, filtered air. Mira, bracing her boots against the corrugated floor, pulled the stubborn rubber with all her might toward the distribution panel on the wall. However, the internal pressure in the main line was rising too quickly. The ventilation corrugation vibrated, tore itself from the medic's scratched fingers, and flew back with a heavy hiss, dousing her face in hot, technical dust. The doors of the freight elevator on the central deck ground open. Cantor stepped onto the platform at the exact moment the crowd of workers raised a heavy hydraulic punch over the airlock plating. His own security guards froze in confusion, not knowing whose orders to follow. The high-ranking official ignored the furious shouts of the port workers and the duty officer's demands to return to the safety zone. He confidently stepped over the bright yellow line of the quarantine perimeter and approached the narrow technical hatch, while inside the compartment, Mira made one last desperate attempt to hold the slipping rubber sleeve. Her fingers slid over the greasy lubricant, her back muscles burned from the extreme strain, and the corrugation began to slip from her hands again with a dull hum, threatening to completely cut off the air supply. At that moment, the outer shutter of the hatch creaked open, and Cantor's hands appeared in the opening, his gloves stained with technical soot. The high-ranking official, whose expensive uniform jacket was already irrevocably ruined by oil stains, leaned his entire body weight against the vibrating plastic and firmly gripped the slipping edge of the hose. Now, the human and a member of the alien race were performing the same heavy physical labor. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow passage, breathing heavily and in sync, holding the pipe that was straining under wild pressure. But while Mira gave her last strength to save specific living beings under the dome, Cantor held that metal to rectify 30 years of systemic lies, which his own government had passed off as security. With a loud click, the heavy fasteners of the corrugation finally snapped into the grooves, and the main lock engaged. A second later, a powerful pulse traveled through the rubber body of the pipe, and a steady, cool stream of clean air from the port kitchen rushed into the smoky shuttle, carrying away the remnants of the acrid chemical cocktail and the panic-induced fear. Cantor slowly unclenched his cramped fingers and turned his back to the locked airlock, blocking the manual locking lever with his own body. The crowd of enraged workers on the platform outside instantly fell silent, lowering their crowbars and cutters. The people stared in a stupor at their high-ranking official, who had openly violated every quarantine instruction in front of hundreds of witnesses. In the ensuing silence of the massive dock, only the low, deep hum of the operating ventilation could be heard, pumping life into the locked trap, while the outer armored doors of the airlock remained tightly shut by the paranoid artificial intelligence. The deafening screech of industrial thermal cutters struck the outer hull of the shuttle. Fresh air from the port kitchen had already filled the cramped compartment, completely displacing the toxic technical steam, but salvation from suffocation brought the colonists no peace. The crowd of stevedores and transit mechanics outside quickly emerged from the short stupor caused by the high-ranking official's unexpected actions. Animal fear of an unknown space infection proved much stronger than subordination, and the workers took up their heavy tools with redoubled fury. Bunches of blinding sparks began to break through micro-cracks in the armored doors of the airlock. The thick blades of plasma cutters bit into the metal with a low hum, illuminating the dark compartment with sharp, jerky flashes. Every new screeching sound made the 40 exhausted creatures flinch and press themselves deeper into the darkest niche of the cargo module. Their respiratory slits on thin necks opened wide, and their chests heaved from extreme tension. There was enough oxygen for everyone now, but the trapped colonists were being slowly killed by a primal terror of their imminent execution. Mira, the port doctor, sat on the dirty deck, leaning the back of her head against the cold, curved bulkhead. Her lungs greedily inhaled the cool flow from the ventilation corrugation, while her hands trembled noticeably from recent physical overexertion. According to all the strict safety protocols of the neutral sector, she should have simply waited for the security guards on duty to cut open the airlock, raised her empty palms, and surrendered silently to the port authorities. But her old, career-breaking habit once again wouldn't allow her to sit still. She watched the gray, sweat-covered figures of the colonists intently as they awaited slaughter at the hands of the enraged crowd. The tangible, pulsing fear of the aliens filled the space of the emergency dock, making the fresh, clean air feel heavy. Leaving them in such a state for the next 20 minutes, while the industrial cutters finally pierced the armor, was absolutely impossible for her. Rescue protocols always ended where deep alien panic began. The medic's gaze caught a dull rectangle on the floor. The small music player that had slipped from her pocket during the fall still lay near the technical drainage grate. Slowly, overcoming the aching pain in her lower back, Mira crawled a couple of meters across the ribbed metal. She picked up the cheap device and wiped the cracked plastic screen with the coarse sleeve of her work jacket, the sensor barely responding to her dirty fingers, stained with machine oil. She pressed the main play button at random. The built-in speaker gave a short rasp and then emitted the clear, rhythmic, and heavy synthetic beat of an old Earth composition. Thick bass lines struck the walls of the metallic module, creating a dense, vibrating sonic background. This monotonous rhythm proved loud enough to partially drown out the maddening shriek of the plasma cutters outside. But music alone was not enough to break the animal fear of the crowd's impending violence. Mira reached for her belt pouch and pulled out a compact field heater, along with the remains of her food ration, 2 hard briquettes of synthetic protein and a packet of vitamin paste. She forcefully snapped the hidden chemical capsule inside the heater, and the plastic housing in her hands instantly became scalding hot. Mira placed a dented metal mug from her diagnostic kit onto it, squeezed the thick nutritional mass inside, and began methodically stirring it with a heavy steel probe. The metal clinked loudly against the sides of the vessel. She did this intentionally loud, putting muscular effort into every movement and hitting the beat of the playing music exactly. The sound of primitive, absolutely safe human routine filled the narrow space between the musical bass thumps. The alien closest to her, who had been hiding its vulnerable throat behind clawed limbs, suddenly froze. Its faceted eyes followed the repetitive movements of the human hands without looking away. The creature felt a paralyzing shame for its helplessness in the face of the approaching assault. Inner instinct demanded immediate action, but the exhausted body refused to enter a doomed fight. The colonists slowly, on unnaturally long legs that were buckling, separated from the group huddled in the corner. It took 2 hesitant steps toward the improvised kitchen, picked up a flat fragment of technical plastic from the floor, and sat down heavily on its haunches 1 meter away from Mira. The alien began to rub the piece of debris forcefully against the rough deck. Its actions had nothing to do with cooking. It was a blind, defensive ritual, a desperate attempt to mirror the movements of a self-assured being in order to somehow soothe its own overloaded nervous system. The human and the alien sat side by side, performing the same monotonous manual labor, though pursuing entirely different goals. A thin plume of steam rose from the field heater. The smell of warmed protein paste proved to be the polar opposite of the pungent aroma of aggressive earth spices or the sterile scent of medical disinfectant. It was a warm, heavy smell of calories and domestic safety. No dangerous predator in the galaxy would slowly prepare food to rhythmic music before tearing its victim apart. The tense back of the colonist beside Mira began to visibly relax. The grating of its plastic against the floor fell into perfect sync with the strikes of the steel probe against the metal mug. The rest of the group in the dark corner also slowly edged forward. Their convulsive, ragged breathing began to level out, synchronizing with the steady, continuous bass from the cheap speaker. Aggressive physical tension was finally receding, giving way to the ordinary fatigue of exhausted organisms. With a dull thud, the colonist dropped the plastic fragment from its weakening claws. Its thin neck stretched out, its gill slits closed tightly, and a series of low, rhythmic, bubbling clicks escaped its chest. The sound was hoarse, cracking, and entirely devoid of threat. The old port speech analyzer, lying near Mira's heavy boot, flickered with its dim screen. The cheap market neural network instantly processed the acoustic signal and produced a short line of text. Tension release, joy response, laughter. The gasping gray creature was laughing. This was not conscious humor, but pure biological discharge after hours of waiting for imminent death. One by one, the other members of the haggard group began to lower their defensive limbs and emit the same vibrating sounds, filling the damaged shuttle with the hum of strange alien merriment. At that very moment, deep within the server arrays of the neutral sector, the station's paranoid artificial intelligence completed its processing of the updated data packet. The internal sensors of the shuttle, which had previously recorded extreme levels of stress hormones and chemical markers of panic, suddenly registered a total collapse of the threat. A new molecular analysis of the air showed the presence of heated food proteins and pheromones of deep relaxation. The central security algorithm was faced with an irreconcilable logical contradiction. Lethal biological threats and enemy combat units do not set up field kitchens or demonstrate mass joy responses. The rigid danger markers that had maintained the quarantine were reset to 0. The autonomous containment protocol lost its mathematical justification, and was immediately canceled by the system. Outside, on the brightly lit central deck of the dock, two large stevedores were just about to drive a heavy hydraulic wedge into the melted gap of the airlock. Suddenly, the thick armored plates trembled slightly. The massive gears of the isolation mechanism let out a deafening screech, and the heavy leaves began to slowly slide apart. The enraged crowd instantly recoiled. People dropped their industrial crowbars in a panic and rushed behind the backs of the security guards with shouts. Chief of Security Cantor's guards synchronously raised their wide tactical shields and leveled the muzzles of their emitters, preparing to face a wave of deadly monsters or a toxic cloud of unknown contagion. Cantor himself remained standing in place, never taking his hard gaze off the widening opening. The smoke from the thermal cutters slowly dissipated, and the harsh, artificial light of the station struck the dark interior of the damaged shuttle. No bloody assault followed. Instead of aggressive alien predators, the armed guards and terrified workers saw an entirely different picture. A tired port doctor sat on the dirty deck, methodically stirring food in a dented mug. Around her, leaning trustingly against one another, sat 40 exhausted, thin creatures with gray scales. A steady musical beat emanated from the cheap music player on the floor, while the aliens made rhythmic bubbling sounds that the old translator screen continued to classify as laughter. The primary historical myth regarding the savagery of both races shattered against this incredibly simple shared existence faster than any official diplomatic investigation could. The threat of destruction was completely lifted, leaving behind only the ringing silence of a vast, bewildered crowd staring at the open door. The system had yet to extract the price for this quarantine breach from the human, but for now, the weapons were slowly being lowered. The dim light of the administrative corridor in the neutral sector smelled of ingrained ozone and scorched wiring. Mira sat on a hard metal bench in front of the closed door of the disciplinary commission office. Her back muscles ached unbearably after the heavy labor with the main ventilation, and a massive tablet lay on her knees, with the text of an official notification open. Port management acted strictly according to dry regulations. The suspension of her medical license was accompanied by a colossal quarantine fine for intentional damage to station property. The crude breach of the transport pod's small technical hatch and the critical deformation of the ventilation corrugation cost an amount significantly exceeding her total earnings for the last 4 years. This debt instantly and automatically blocked her right to purchase a transit ticket to the Central Earth sectors. With one formal decision, the system moved Mira from the status of a sought-after specialist to the category of non-exit residents of the port periphery. From around the smooth curve of the corridor, the military commandant's office convoy appeared. Armed security guards were leading a group of rescued colonists for official registration. The creatures looked completely different than they had 2 hours ago in the smoke-filled and oxygen-deprived dock. Their scales had regained a solid gray hue. Their thin bodies were no longer racked by extreme muscular tremors, and their long necks no longer arched in convulsive attempts to hide their vulnerable respiratory slits. They walked with an even pace, looking at the sterile white walls of the station with slight curiosity. The alien nearest to the metal bench suddenly stopped. He turned his narrow head toward Mira and slowly raised a clawed limb. The creature made a precise, conscious movement in the air, pressing an invisible object against an invisible surface with force. The alien was exactly repeating the heavy gesture of grinding earth spices that they had done together on the floor of the Suffocating module. In his faceted eyes, one could read a calm recognition of their shared rescue ritual. A guard, with a muffled curse, roughly shoved the colonist in the back with the edge of a shield, breaking the contact. The group disappeared behind the heavy doors of the distribution block, and Mira was left alone again in the empty corridor, staring at the red blinking status of her financial sentence. The door of the disciplinary commission office slid into the wall with a quiet pneumatic hiss. Cantor appeared on the threshold. He was no longer wearing his expensive uniform jacket with its stiff collar and insignia. The high-ranking official had changed into a simple gray technician's tunic, completely devoid of any signs of high status. He did not utter a single word, and did not even look toward the tired port medic. Cantor walked with a confident stride to the wall-mounted terminal for port fees. He pulled his personal high-level identification token from his pocket and drove it into the device's receiving slot with a loud click. The holographic screen went dark for a moment, and then began systematically deducting enormous funds. The station's former chief accuser silently transferred his accumulated pension fund and the entire remainder of his government subsidies to the account for paying off the port doctor's fine. The green progress bar quickly reached the edge of the display, and the status on Mira's tablet gave a short beep, changing to a confirmation of full payment. Cantor pulled the token from the receiver, reached into the deep pocket of his gray tunic, and pulled out a dented metal thermos along with 2 diagnostic mugs. He slowly unscrewed the lid, and thick steam rose into the cool, sterile air of the administrative corridor. The sharp, pungent aroma of earth spices, thyme, and strong brewed tea, the very organics that the authorities had considered a deadly weapon for 30 years, instantly displaced the smell of ozone. The mechanical drives of the automatic security cameras buzzed quietly, focusing their lenses on this violation of the old rules. Directly beneath the red lenses of the system, Cantor handed 1 hot mug to the man and took a long sip from his own. There was no reconciliation or attempt to forge a friendship in this action. It was a calm, defiant rejection of systemic fear, documented forever by the internal network for the entire sector management. The tablet on Mira's knees vibrated quietly again. The red frame of the financial lock vanished, replaced by a message granting open clearance for departure to any Earth worlds. She looked up from the flickering screen, but Cantor had already silently turned away and was walking down the long administrative corridor toward the cargo docks, there where the aliens were currently being processed. The port doctor remained sitting before the terminal with a fully paid ticket home. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the hot metal of the mug, feeling the throbbing ache in her blistered palms. Returning to the safe central worlds had lost all meaning for her. Her old professional habit, the absolute impossibility of turning away from those who were deathly afraid, had tied her to this place forever. Mira understood that her skills belonged right here, on the very edge of the station, where shared labor meant more than perfect protocols. The air hummed steadily in the ventilation grates, and the taste of cooling tea remained on her tongue. Any lumbering system always relies on crude iron and algorithms of blind isolation, like a heavy mechanism capable only of a mindless, forceful solution. But real, intelligent work, as this day in the port dock had shown, requires flexibility. Sometimes it is enough to correctly apply simple organics and find the right rhythm to rewrite old, paranoid rules and save those whom everyone else has abandoned. And what would you have done, finding yourself before a locked airlock with frightened creatures? Write in the comments. I always welcome a healthy discussion. This was Rama. See you soon.